Hello, welcome to the latest episode of Zero Hangers Trade Target Series for 2024. And today's episode, we're going to be covering Port Adelaide's trade targets for the upcoming off-season, who they could potentially looking at. And to do that with me is Zero Hanger reporter Frank Seal. Frank, how are you, mate?
Good, thank you. Mitch, how are you?
I'm very well. I'm keen to get into this one because the Power coming off a pretty busy off-season last year where many or few thought that maybe they had found the list pieces they needed to take that extra step. Obviously, a top four finish last year, straight sets exit. Got some key defensive reinforcements. A change in their ruck department, who I think Ivan Solder and Jordan Sweet have been probably on the level that you can kind of expect. It didn't cost them too much, I'd say, in the end, and they certainly needed a change. Got it. And I think, a fit Soldo and some competition from Sweet will go a long way. Sava Radaglia and Brandon Zerk-Thatcher in defence have been up and down. I think we're starting to see the best of Zerk-Thatcher's abilities in recent weeks, but Radaglia is certainly up and down. Similar to what I guess we saw with Geelong. But this year, in this off-season, depending on where they finish, it's going to be quite fascinating once again, just to who they could be targeting. You'd expect them to be busy and maybe looking at small forwards, some, attacking depth, maybe some midfield depth, maybe some support for either a Soldo or a Sweet that can play forward. Where do you kind of see Port Adelaide's list at the moment?
It's a relatively tough spot. There could be a lot of change if their season falls out the way it looks like it could, especially at the top. If they don't make finals, Ken Hinkley might go. And that sort of change at the top could trickle down to changes with amongst the playing group, of course. So they'd be looking to add some sort of premiership experience, like of some sort, to add to that, given they think they're in the window. We don't really know that yet, but I guess it just depends on how their season finishes.
Yeah, you'd have to think that they certainly believe they've got the list to contend, but that they are probably maybe a piece or two away. Their midfield is fine, the top level of that midfield. When you've got three of the best young on-ballers in the competition, and then you add in a Brownlow medalist in Ollie Wines, the experience of Trav Boak, the, defensive edge that Willem Drew brings, and then a few other options there. I would like to see maybe a couple more coming through. They'll lose Boak, whether it's this year, next year. Wines has a few years left, but there certainly is a transition period that, once you get Horne-Francis into his prime, you'd like to think, it'd be crazy to think, but you'd like to think that Rosie and Butters have another step or two to go, and that they can kind of have some more pressing from underneath. So that'll be interesting to see if that is an area they look at. But I think, they've looked at some small forwards, and that might be a good area, to get someone to match. Willie Rioli. Sam Palpepper out this year certainly opened up that void a bit for them in 2024, and they'll get him back to start next season. But I think it's still an area that they'd like to look at. Let's jump into a few names. And for those that are maybe familiar enough with the the series that we've done on YouTube and also our editorial series, is that we do film these probably a week after writing them on zerohanger.com, and every now and then that'll open up to a few late changes if there's a bit of a shift. So initially on this list we did have Jai Menzies and Ben Ainsworth, who Ainsworth was one that's been tied to Port Adelaide, and Menzies has previously he got himself into the AFL from some great sample form. I thought he would have been a nice one. But both those guys re-signing at their respective clubs, it's given us a few changes. But we'll start with the three names that we did have penciled in on our initial list, and all three are Jacks. And the first one is one quite familiar with Port Adelaide and potential trade interest, and that's Premiership Tiger Jack Graham. Another South Australian, I think someone when you talk about some midfield depth, if they lose a Travis Boak this year and a Jack Graham comes in, and he probably has a bit more versatility, able to play, maybe forward of the ball. I think he could be a free agent at that, so he's not going to cost them too much either.
Yeah, well, that's the premiership experience and knowledge that the Power are obviously begging for if they want to make the most of their window. The midfield is obviously stacked, so you'd probably have to play forward, and the fit there is sort of uncertain. But it might not matter if he's desperate to come back home, so we'll see how that goes. He's only 26, so he's in the middle of his prime. Does get injured a fair bit. Probably plays that wing role, maybe rolls forward. He can hit the scoreboard. He's a good finisher, noted as that. He's never averaged 20 disposals, which surprised me. He's probably more defensively focused when he does play that midfield role, tackles well, which is a bonus for Port Adelaide given their critique being sort of lackluster defensively, especially recently. So it may happen. Question is how it works with the midfield of Butters, Rosie, Horne-Francis, Drew, Wines, but definitely an option for them.
Yeah, he's an interesting one. If his preference was to go to SA, I don't know if Adelaide would have a lot of interest, given they've got a lot of the same type of midfielder and they kind of want a bit more speed through there. And then Drew is that real defensive-minded midfielder, and I think Graham can offer that. But outside of that rotation, I think he'd be okay across half forward. He does go from one elite midfield group to another, and I think Richmond's is kind of exiting that era. But so there certainly would be better opportunities if he wanted to stay, but certainly it's going to be something to consider for him, given he's unsigned and could potentially look elsewhere. And I think Port Adelaide may ask the question. Certainly be worth it. They were interested a couple of years ago, and there might be some level of interest there if they can get him pretty cheap, given his free agency status. The next one is Jack Carroll at Carlton, like Graham, and the rest on this list off contract, still unsigned for 2025. Only in the first few years of his career, and I think he's shown some good glimpses at the Blues. He's getting centre bounce attendances in one of the most stacked midfield groups, and it's obviously very hard for him to get ongoing opportunities, just given they often come for him just because of injury. So I think is he going to get the same situation at Port Adelaide? Potentially, but you'd like to think that he certainly raises that depth and that level of depth, and I'm potentially a better option than Graham, particularly with youth on his side.
Yeah, could boost the young crop at Port Adelaide for sure. Would get more minutes than he's probably getting at Carlton. But again, it's where. So the midfield's obviously stacked, as we've said. Probably play forward. He's clean under pressure, but he hasn't shown a whole lot. He hasn't had that breakout game, no bag of goals. His career high is still 1. His status, if he plays forward, would be unknown. He's 188 centimetres, so he's too small to be a tall forward and too tall to be a small forward, really. And playing that medium-sized third or fourth fiddle is like footy purgatory. So there'd be a struggle if he does play that role. Maybe they trial him down back just to try something. Could be an adequate rebounder, potentially interceptor, one-on-one defender. We don't really know. But if Dan Houston's on the way out, as is rumoured recently, then that could be one to test.
Yeah, I think his ability as a forward is something that certainly could be tapped into. And then as a midfielder, very similar to Graham, I'd say. And it'd just be interesting to see how the Blues would rate the value of Carroll. I think he's highly rated, but whether they can keep him is another question. And then the third Jack that we have, a South Australian that spent the last few seasons at St Kilda since earning an AFL contract as a mature age recruit, is Jack Hayes, who, as we flagged at the top of the show, is that ruck forward hybrid. Obviously they've relied on Jeremy Finlayson and at times Charlie Dixon, and with those two, into the twilight of their careers, they do have, Georgiades, Ollie Lord, Todd Marshall at the forefront for the future. But Hayes, I think, could be a nice fourth piece. We've seen how tall they like to kind of go between the forward line and ruck, and I think a player who is half ruckman, half forward is exactly the type that they would want. Hayes, injury history hasn't been exciting for him, I guess, with what we've been able to see. But I think the upside is certainly there. And another SA guy who's off contract, so they'd certainly be, keeping tabs, if anything. Yeah,
it's that same old Port Adelaide move, bringing in a new out-of-favour ruckman from another club. There's Scott Lysette, Jordan Sweet, Ivan Soldo. It's hard to see it as a priority, and the injury is obviously a concern, but he does bring that key forward presence, as you mentioned, so it could be that Charlie Dixon replacement if he moves on at the end of the year, which looks likely to back up Todd Marshall and Mitch Georgiades. Saints fans will remember he did have 18 touches, 10 marks and 3 goals in his first ever AFL game, and polled a Brownlow vote. And that was also Nick Dacos' first game, so he's got that wood over him. The first game got a Brownlow vote when Dacos didn't. He is 28 years old though, so with his injury history, there may not be long left in his career. So I'll move to Port Adelaide. It's not much more than a homecoming story, but it's little impact on their premiership prospects, but one to watch, I guess.
And the next two names are kind of, more of a focus on list position. And these are just kind of two outsider options. As we mentioned, Ainsworth and Menzies probably could have been better fits, but with them now no chance of moving. These are just two guys. So Riley Garcia and Lincoln McCarthy. Now, we'll get to McCarthy in a bit, but Garcia is one who I think is one of the better performing players who is out of favour and unable to break back into Luke Beveridge's side. Like his VFL form is one thing, and I think we get that a lot, that how good a player is at VFL and then taking that step up to AFL, there can be quite a big difference, and that can be the case for many, but I thought Garcia's form was absolutely fine. Luke Beveridge flagged that there's probably some defensive efforts that he wasn't too happy with from the midfield forward, and that's probably cost him a spot in the side, and they do have a lot of the similar type as well, which doesn't help, but I would like to think that, unsigned, not tied to Victoria as a home state either, that he could certainly consider his options and get more opportunities. I think he'd be a great kind of half forward fit who can help through midfield when required at Port Adelaide.
It'd be a nice to have player. He'd struggle to be that sort of top small forward over Willie Rioli, and probably wouldn't get near the midfield they've got. And competing with Frankie Evans and Jed McEnteep is probably not his ideal scenario, but he has shown a bit this year, albeit in just 8 games. 15 disposals per game is a pretty solid effort as a primary forward. And the last game he played was probably his career best. He had 23 and kicked a goal against Brisbane. So again, it won't be shifting their list dynamic or anything, or like adding All-Australian calibre or anything like that, but it would be a bonus for Port Adelaide.
Yeah, and then the other one we mentioned, Lincoln McCarthy. This is a pretty left field one for the Power to consider, but if you're looking at, small forwards, if you're looking at SA players and you're looking at players who are off contract, he ticks all 3 boxes. Obviously sidelined this season through an ACL, which makes it a bit of a risky move, and whether he'd look to depart Brisbane for a move back home remains to be seen, but it'd certainly be a good fit if they could lure him back to SA.
Yeah, well, unlike Garcia, he would slot straight into that primary small forward role, even over Rioli. He and Rioli would form one of the best small forward duos in the comp, at least for a year. It's they bring different skill sets. So McCarthy's more aerial, more pressure focused, works higher up the ground. Rioli more ground level, more flair, closer to goal, and makes more magic happen. So that could be a very potent duo if it were to work out. And if Ken Hinkley or whoever's coaching needs the difference maker to roll through the midfield in the third quarter when things are falling away, he could be that man as well. He's got that experience in the grand final, so brings some sort of value there. He's nearly 31 and he does have an injury history, so it's more of a win now move than anything else. But that makes it somewhat risky given Port's status as a premiership contender is arguable. So it's a risky move because if it doesn't work, then they'd be probably heavily criticised for it. Yeah,
it'd be a difficult one, especially if he misses out on potential flag this year. You'd like to think he wants to stick around and with the Lions for another year at the very least. And he hasn't got too much time left in his footy career. But he'll be an interesting one if there's no deal done quite late into the off season. That'll wrap up our trade targets piece for Port Adelaide. We'll move on to Richmond in our next episode. You can catch all the latest news, views and opinions on zerohanger.com.